When you're painting a portrait in oil on paper, one of the first things that you need to think about is the ground that you're working in. Basically speaking, if I put oil paint straight on that surface, it's not going to want to move, for the simple reason that that paper is absorbing that colour immediately. So it's a really good idea to try to loosen that surface of paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just get some solvent down on that surface. Not only am I going to get some solvent down, I'm also going to get some basic colour down. Here I'm sort of taking a general clue from the head. As soon as I've killed off the absorbency of that paper, then my paint is going to move around much more freely. Classically in oil painting they talk about lean to fat applications of colour. So using quite solventy colour is going to be quite lean. Now I'm just using a really simple palette here of a lemon yellow, a crimson and an ultramarine. So a red, yellow, blue combination plus titanium white. I find it very difficult to not use the titanium white. I find zinc white much more challenging, but the zinc white will certainly give you much more kind of luminosity. So the starting point really is, as I say, reducing the absorbency of that ground down. Already that brush is moving a lot faster over the surface. The next thing is to start building in an element of construction. And what you want to do is you want to think about the main directions of the head. So if I look at this direction through the eyes here, move that brush across and then try to establish that angle. So I'm just going to check that moving backwards and forwards through there. I want to look at that angle through the eye. I want to look at that main angle, the plane of the head. So I'm looking at that angle and that angle. Usually there's about an eye distance between each eye, so I can just check that. Yep. And in a sense I need to sort of establish that group of 3 marks. So as you can see, those are all about the same. Now it's really useful now to look at the angle between the outer edge of the eye and the nose, and we try to bring that angle down. We then look at this angle on the nose, and what we're trying to sort of see is this kind of this inverted triangle. We can also start to think about where we see the corner of the nose in relationship to the eye. So almost like trigonometry, we can start to locate the position of the nose. Now the nose, the base of the nose, is kind of roughly parallel to that main direction through the eye, which in turn is kind of parallel with the eyebrows. So somewhere along that line we're going to find the eyebrows. Somewhere along that line we're going to find the base of the nose. Running parallel to that line, and that line will also be the mouth. And for the moment I'm just going to kind of rough the mouth in. So I'm trying to get a sort of general sense of the head. Now it's very possible that I'm going to get some of these proportions incorrect. So one of the important things for me to do is to kind of measure the distance between the base of the nose and the mouth and compare that with something I've already drawn. So fundamentally it's a kind of comparative set of measurements rather than a sight size measurement. So at this point I might start to look at the features, but rather than thinking about the features, Instead, what I'm trying to do is to think about the space between the features. So the space underneath the eye, for instance. Obviously, an older face gives you more kind of landscape references, really. You know, you've got points of departure where you can really sort of think about one space in relationship to another, and Mike Leigh certainly got a load of those. So where is that nostril? So trying to sort of find one's way through that sort of space, through this space inside here, looking at that sort of link as well. So, you know, when you've got creases and folds on the head, it makes life a lot easier. Whereas obviously if there's much less of that, particularly when you get into young children or beautiful women, it makes the whole process of painting a portrait much more difficult. So now that I've got some kind of sense of the relationships between the eyes, the nose and the mouth, again what I now can do is think about where that distance is and compare that to something I've drawn. So I reckon that that sort of distance is where my mouth is. Okay, these things might be moved around. Okay, if I take that distance and bring that down one more, and then maybe 1.5, one more, and then 1.5, about there, I reckon that's going to give me basically the sort of edge of the beard. The top of the head, measuring from here, eyebrow to the top of the head, if again I bring that down, that's pretty much off the edge of my paper. If I measured across here and brought that across by 1, then over here somewhere I'm going to be finding the back of that head. So these distances from here to here, from here to here, these are the ones that are really easy to miss-see, particularly as there's much less information. What I need to think about when I'm making a painting is I really do need to think about tonality. How light or dark is this particular area? And in a way it doesn't matter whether I've got the colour right or not. Colour is after all relational. So when I put a colour down on my palette to when I put a colour down on here, that relationship can often be quite different. So really what I want to think about early on is this idea of what's the tonality of that area, how light or dark is that area, and how light or dark is that on my picture. Particularly when you're working with things like oil on paper, then because the support is so absorbent, colour decisions that I make early on can be quite quickly overpainted. So you can see that once you've reduced the absorbency of that ground down, it's much easier to start moving the paint around. As we start to make the initial kind of blocks of tone, it's also important that we start to think about the sort of general shifts of the head as well. So again, it's very easy to undersee different parts of the head. So concentrating on the features can be a problem if you lose sight of the big distances that you're dealing with. So again, things like where the top of this head is, as I've already said, if we measure down from here and bring that down, you know, that's quite a distance up through the paper. I think we can just about get the top of that head into that paper. Again, it doesn't matter if we've got it absolutely right from the beginning, we can shift things around. So we're looking at kind of big shapes, big tones. When you simplify your palette down and you're only using 3 primaries, of course the key thing to think about is mixing. So being really playful with your mixing. Don't worry too much about trying to establish the local colour, as I've said already. You know, is this a red, is this a green, is this a blue? Instead, it's much more interesting, I think, to be playing around with the idea of what colour could this be. Of course, when you start off quite thinly, you're putting colour down quite leanly, that colour will dry fairly quickly. So on nylon paper study like this will certainly be sort of tack dry-ish, you know, within a couple of hours. But obviously if I start to add more white to the equation, if my paint starts to get thicker, then that's going to take longer to dry. And I would expect a nylon paper study to really take, you know, about, well, at least a week, I would have said. So when you're mixing in your palette, obviously the colour of your palette will affect your ability to judge the colour that you're, you know, trying to find. So in this instance I'm painting on white paper and I've got a white palette. And in a sense, one at the moment is trying to sort of half close one's eyes and to think, you know, is this a warm area? Is this a cool area? Is this a light area? Is this a dark area? One of the things that I talk about a lot, I think, is the idea of viscosity and how thick or thin, how fluid or dry the paint is all important in terms of understanding how to paint a subject. That experimentation in the early stages of your painting discoveries is vitally kind of essential. You know, what sort of paint should I be using? If I've decided to use oil paint, that's great. But then, you know, what kind of brush am I using to put the paint on? A hog hair brush has a very different kind of characteristic than a sable type brush. This is a synthetic brush. So you tend to find that when you're using a synthetic, you're using, you know, you're putting less colour down. But because you're putting less colour down, you might find it easier to kind of control. I always think it's a good idea to mix up less colour than you think. When you put, you know, mix a lot of colour up on your palette, there's particularly when you're using really good quality oil paint, you know, and you've spent maybe £10–15 per tub, a tube of colour, you know, when you've mixed a large amount of colour up, temptation is to use it all. And what you then end up with is the whole painting becomes one kind of generic colour. So if you mix up less colour to start with, that forces you to mix and to build within your picture making colour variation, which I think is much more interesting visually. So here I'm trying to take clues from the image. As I said, is this a warm area? Is this a cool area? Is this orange-ish, green-ish, blue-ish? And playing around with those interpretations. And as I've said, a colour on the palette behaves very differently when a colour is placed next to another colour. So in a sense, one is kind of trying to find out what that colour is, and that only happens when it's actually on the surface. One's really focusing not on the object but the spaces between each element. Try as much as possible to do as much work as you can with your big brushes. When you work with small brushes, you end up getting quite a lot of paint on the surface, and you can also get quite streaky results. So trying to sort of do the big work with the big brushes is, I think, very advantageous. Of course, as time goes by, you need to think about your palette and the size of your palette. As you start to mix colour on your palette, all your colours are inevitably going to start to intermix. So keeping your colour clean and fresh is dependent upon a number of things. One, the size of your palette. So as I've stated on other occasions and on other videos, your palette really should be the size of your painting, if not larger. If you've got a big palette, it gives you room to mix. I'm currently working on 2 palettes at the moment. I have one of those tear-off palettes, sort of ready-made palettes that are made from almost like a kind of greaseproof paper. And that's where I've placed my colour. And I've also got a piece of newspaper. I really enjoy the way that newspaper absorbs the oiliness from my colour, and it starts to give me a more sort of tacky, resistant feel to my paint. Obviously everyone has personal preferences, so again, investigating the opacity of your colour, how you put it on, what tools you use, all of those factors are really important kind of elements of discovery. Once I've got kind of main areas blocked in, my next task is to really start focusing on finding maybe the more kind of controlled elements of drawing. So I've sometimes talked about the idea of filling the drawing and finding the drawing. And for a long time, when I painted in acrylic, I started by blocking in large expanses of colour. Gradually, as I moved the colour around, I began to discover where the figure or the head was. When I first started working with oil paint, I found that when I did that, I got myself into an almighty mess. And it's taken me a long time to really feel that I can start using oil paint the way that I used to use acrylic. And that's through experimentation. I calculated the other day that in a 10-year period, I think I've made 500 oil paintings. So somewhere in that process, I began to understand how to use the stuff. It's at this moment when you're working on the image and you're starting to refine some of the elements of the drawing, you begin to question your decision making. And I feel at the moment that I've not quite seen where those features are. So now that I've got a certain amount of colour on my paper, I can remove some of that colour, and one's left with a kind of stain of where you were. So I want to try to re-establish those initial decisions that I had. I want to look particularly at that angle. I think I've brought that eye in further than it should have been. So I think that eye is further over here. I want to just check that I've got that angle correct. So I think the eye is further over here. If I'm happy with that distance, which I think I am, I'm just going to reconnect that. And it's that objectification of the head into a series of shapes that's really important, because one can utterly convince oneself that one's drawn a really beautiful eye, and you get 3/4 the way into the drawing and you realise that you put it in the wrong place, it's the wrong size. So this mutability of the paint becomes really valuable. And I think that's one of the things that took me a long time to appreciate with oil paint. I was used to the idea that the decision that I made in acrylic was a fast decision, and that if I got it wrong I could just paint over and paint over, which ended up meaning that your paintings became quite kind of crusty with their various layers. Whereas with oil I could just scrape it off. And even to the point where obviously, different layers of paint take different amounts of time to dry. I could come back a week or so later and remove what I'd done. And in a way it's not being frightened to take the ball by the horns and to say, no, it's not quite right, it's not as it should be, change it. It's that enjoyment of getting lost and kind of trying to navigate your way out of that space. When I was at art school, one of my colleagues at the time, Aftab Sardar, described colour as being on the palette, and it took me a long time to realise that you really are mixing and playing, testing and finding, trying to discover the right piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So it's almost like one kind of has to navigate from a position of assuredness, and you kind of return back maybe to a point where you think, yeah, I think I've got that correct, and then working from there to sort of re-see. And sometimes the removal of colour becomes a constructive element to the picture making. So inevitably I tend to get quite grubby brushes and quite grubby palettes. So for me the ability to dispose of a grubby palette is advantageous. So that's where newspaper's really handy. Tear off palettes are really handy. And if I'm working on a really large scale, then I'll work on cellophane. Sheets of cellophane can be tacked to my tabletop using just moisture at the bottom, and once that's completely full with colour, it's very easy to then remove. So I want to still try to make sure that I'm getting things at the right height, so those early parallels are still quite important. Objectification of the head, trying to see the head without those kind of preconceptions, is always tricky, and there are some techniques that you can use. Half closing your eyes and trying to see the sort of general masses of colour, light and dark, etc., is useful. Looking at your painting in a mirror, looking at the reference material as well in a mirror can be useful. And with mirrors you can not only hold the mirror up to the image so you see both images reflected, so left becomes right, but also you can hold it above the image so that you're looking at the image upside down as well as the reference. And they can be useful, but overuse of the mirror again means that you end up not being able to see what you've done. Obviously, if you're working from life, you can take your measurements directly from the head. If you're working from a photograph, you can grid your photograph and you can work from the gridded image. Obviously the finer the grid, the more accurate the observation, which invariably means that I stand the risk of starting going great guns and then coming back to rework. So it can be really seductive to see something in the image and think it's a curve, and then realise actually I've just seen too much of that curve. So again, that addition subtraction process. And when you put a colour down and you realise it's the wrong colour, in a sense that then starts to tell you what the right colour needs to be. So for me at this stage it's all about trying to see the big structures again, to find my way round those elements, to try to see whether I've made the right decisions. Going back to that initial set of thoughts. Why am I seeing this head? Am I seeing this head as light or dark? What are the elements that are really key? Of course, another really important element is the head is not just seen in isolation. The head has a space behind it. It might be that the establishment of that space really helps pull the painting together. Again, if one goes too far, if you've got some oil already there, you can erase back. The screen of my camera showing me the straight on view of this picture, I've realised that I've stretched the dimensions. I'm not quite seeing where that head is. And of course, if you're unhappy with it, scrape down and start again. So it's about 4 hours since I started this oil on paper study of Mike Leigh, and as I got towards kind of a finishing state almost, I realised that the structure of the head was wrong, and I think in part that was due to the fact that I was looking at this head at a raking angle. So I was seeing a foreshortened view of the head, which meant that I was stretching that head across. One of the key things that I wanted to note as well was those sort of basic things like what's the angle of that head, and have I managed to see that angle? I think I'd actually tilted the head a bit more upright. And so I've restructured the drawing, working back into the painting with a graphite stick. As I took all the oil paint off, I'm just left with a very thin, slightly tacky residue of oil paint to work back into. I think I've kind of mentioned before that if you think about the construction of a painting, you can think about it as a series of visual problems, a kind of drawing problem, a tonal problem, and a colour problem. And usually if something's gone wrong, it's one of those things, and it's picking out the key thing that needs to be addressed. At any one time. Of course one could wait for the painting to dry completely, and the surface quality of that painting will be quite different to work into. At the moment I'm just combining my oil paint with turpentine. I'm still working quite leanly with the colour. I'm still maintaining a similar range of brushes. One of the things that the break did enable me to do was to clean up everything, which is always a good thing. So the painting got scraped down again, and once it was scraped down again, one of the things that I really saw for the first time was that I'd cut this angle completely wrong. I'd made it much more upright, and I hadn't noticed that. So once I'd scraped it down, I could then correct this angle. Once I'd done that, I could also start to reconfigure the beard and started to see where I'd gone wrong across the whole picture. So fundamentally what we've talked about is this idea that, you know, you really do need to pay attention to those basic measurements right at the beginning, because if you don't do that, then you can find yourself 3/4 way into the painting struggling with something fundamental. That first few minutes spent measuring and getting the proportions of the head correct would have saved me a lot more work later on. However, as I also said, that process of addition, subtraction, discovery, finding the character of Mike Leigh within the painting is what makes the process really exciting.